Alan Bertram. I'm a director at K2 Ryder Hunt. We're construction cost consultants. I've got a particular passion about health and wellbeing and how that actually impacts commercial performance. So just to start the sort of piece off, really, workplace wellbeing, whether you think of it in terms of health, happiness, engagement or productivity, are nothing new. In 1906, the Larkin Soap Building opened and was one of the first to consider workplace wellbeing. The large central atrium provided connectivity between the workforce across all floors with plentiful natural light. Characteristics of current day workplaces recognised as good workplace environments. In the 1920s, at the Western Electric plant in Hawthorne, experiments were undertaken which found links to productivity by paying attention to workers' needs. This included things like free food, increased breaks, reducing the length of the working day, once again demonstrated in the current day workplace by tech companies, and in the case of reduced working hours successfully trialled in Scandinavia recently. In the mid-20th century, Peter Drucker wrote on new methods of business management, which included concepts such as outsourcing, decentralisation, respect for employees, identifying people as an asset to business, and coining the phrase knowledge worker. Edward Deming was another who wrote throughout most of the 20th century, with his later work in the 1980s and early 90s focusing on a people-based approach to economics for business and industry. We talk about the pace of change in technology today, but nearly 25 years ago, Erik Brynjolfsson wrote The Productivity Paradox, discussing the impact of technology and its failure to produce incremental improvements in productivity. His findings 25 years ago still ring true today, when he found that as more investment is made in technology, productivity could in fact go down. Nothing has changed in this respect over the last 25 years. We're all typically interrupted every 11 minutes, be it by phone, email, social media or other means, which is then followed by up to 20-minute period of regaining our focus. In context, that's potentially 8 interruptions per working day, which could amount to 2 hours or 25% of non-productive time. Of the 33.5 million people employed in the UK, around 28 million of those work in the service sector, with a large proportion relying on offices of some sort to undertake their day-to-day work. And despite record rents and rising energy costs, people typically form 90% of the cost of a business. Yet the people-based benefits considered so intangible that the easy target of reducing property cost is often taken, but at what expense? Too often, property strategy revolves around reducing costs, with the people aspects being a second thought. However, if we continue to chip away at the element forming 10% of an organisation's costs, are we really considering the impact that this is having on the 90% of the business where revenue is generated? If we turn our focus towards creating a 10% improvement to the 90% people cost, that's clearly better than making a 10% saving on the 10% property cost. The impacts of our current property cost reduction approach can already be seen in the productivity data for the UK over the last 10 years. Despite continuing economic growth, productivity of the UK workforce is effectively lower than it was in 2007. The recession ended some time ago. However, working hours have increased at a greater rate than output, creating a negative impact on productivity. Average annual productivity growth in the UK between 1998 and 2007 was 2.5% a year. With negligible growth in productivity for the last 10 years, we are now around 17% less productive than we should be. That's about an hour and a half every working day for every individual, or close to 7 hours per week. There are various schools of thought on the reasons for this, but with nearly 85% of the UK working population employed in the service sector, the working environment must be a factor. Although things are changing, the foundations of our service industry working patterns are built on the manufacturing practices of the early 20th century. The Gallup State of the Workplace poll found that only 13% of people worldwide are engaged and inspired at work. The UK fares a little better, with 26%. However, this still means nearly 3/4 of people in the UK are not engaged or actively disengaged at work. We're already in a war for talent, and this is only likely to get worse. The DWP forecasts that job vacancies will reach 13.5 million in the next 10 years. However, there are only 7 million young people coming out of our schools and joining the workforce during that period. So with a shortfall of 6.5 million people, 2/3 of the existing workforce not being engaged, and the cost of replacing a departing employee being somewhere between 150 and 200% of their annual salary, the potential for improved business performance is huge. One of the barriers to a people-based focus has been how we make well-being a more tangible factor for business. Employee well-being, happiness and engagement can have a positive effect, and research shows that a relationship of trust can reduce stress, increase energy, improve satisfaction, and importantly, improve staff retention. Studies have also proven that organisations recognised as best places to work typically see stock market returns of twice the market average. These top performing firms appear on the best places to work list due to their strong employee trust foundation, and typically show productivity 19% above average, 20% greater innovation, and absenteeism reduced by 1/3. So the next step is to start capturing this value in a form that can be easily understood. So none of this is new. We've taken a brief look back at the history of these concepts over the last 100 years, yet organisations continue to measure performance in cost per square foot, hours worked, and just how many people they can squeeze into a building. So why do we do this? Partly, as until recently, we haven't had the technology to help us measure people-based aspects, but mostly because it's easy. Measuring engagement, happiness, well-being, and productivity is not easy, but it's not impossible. So if we change our focus and measure things like staff retention, absenteeism, air quality, lighting levels, and output, then consider the environment and facilities we're providing for the UK workforce, what might happen. After 2 years in development, we're now using our bespoke in-house tool WellPro Workplace on commercial office projects to complement the construction cost advice we're providing. WellPro uses HR data from over 28,000 organisations to forecast on a sector-by-sector basis the potential improvements in cash, time and cost per square foot achievable through wellbeing, staff retention and productivity improvements. We can use this alongside our forecast project capital expenditure to provide our clients with credible data on how their organisation or building might perform from day one onwards in their new space. Beyond this, we can use WellPro to measure actual improvements achieved, and longer term to measure changes in the key people metrics to a point where WellPro can identify over the long term when aspects like absence, retention and productivity change to a point that the operational performance cost differential is such that a reinvestment in the workplace environment may provide better value than the status quo. Let's work through a quick example for a typical City of London financial services organisation. Keeping things simple, let's say there are 100 people in 10,000 square foot, with staff typically taking the average absence for the financial sector of 3.6 days and the financial sector average of 15% of staff moving to another employer during the course of a year. If we implement strategies to reduce absence of 3.6 days a year by just over 1 day per person, this equates to 122 additional people days of value, or 46,000 on the bottom line, or in property speak, £5 a square foot. In very basic terms, that's half a person per year in time, or 0.5% of instant added value to the business every year. Similar improvement in staff retention in reducing departing numbers by 1/3 from 15 to 10% per year through creating a workplace with a health and wellbeing focus would add 555 people days, or 211k on the bottom line, or £21 a square foot. That's another 2.5% of added value, or the equivalent of 2.5 additional people onto the business every year. Productivity is a difficult animal to measure, and exactly what it is can be very different from business to business, depending what their output is. So let's keep things easy and consider productivity purely in terms of time for argument's sake. We've been through the 17% productivity lag we currently have in the UK and the potential for technology and interruptions to impact a similar amount of time. So if we then create a building or workplace, we target a 5% improvement in productivity. That's just 24 minutes per day per person. This creates the equivalent of 5 additional people, 425k on the bottom line, or £43 a square foot. That's another 5% of added value every year. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to a workplace. Every firm is different, as is each person employed. Simply implementing a new workplace without full employee engagement in the process increases the risk of a missed opportunity. Added value of over £600,000 per year, or £69 per square foot, will create an environment that generates added value equivalent to 8 additional people in a 100-person business every year is significant, and over a lease duration could mitigate a significant proportion, if not all, of the property costs over that period. What I've just outlined only equates to an 8% improvement on that 17% lag in productivity that we have, so it's purely a modest example of what's achievable. And I have focused these benefits from an occupier perspective, but they equally apply to landlords and show how consideration of certain elements of base build design, although sometimes more costly in capex terms, may provide a performance incentive for potential tenants. Healthy buildings create environments that improve well-being, engagement and productivity, which most importantly pays attention to the 90% of the service sector business that generates revenue. So the question is, with a workforce shortfall of 6.5 million people over the next 10 years, and 3/4 of the existing workforce not being engaged at work, can UK business afford to miss the opportunity for improved performance that proper consideration of health and well-being in the workplace might deliver? Thank you.